Fred Behrens took 5 bullets during a medevac mission in Vietnam and spent 2 nights alone in the jungle, while everyone back at base thought he was dead. This is one of those stories that changes the way you think about what helicopter pilots went through in that war. Because it's not just about getting shot down once or surviving one bad day. It's about a young man who flew into hell over and over again until hell finally caught up with him. And even then, Fred Behrens refused to die. Fred Behrens grew up as an aviation nut. That's how he describes himself, and when you hear him talk about helicopters, you can tell it goes all the way back to childhood. Some kids dream about being astronauts or baseball players, but Fred Behrens dreamed about flying. He was the kind of kid who could identify aircraft by sound alone, who built model planes and hung them from his bedroom ceiling, who rode his bicycle to the local airport just to watch the planes take off and land. The dream of flight consumed him in the way that only childhood dreams can, totally and completely, with the absolute certainty that this was what he was meant to do. When it came time to figure out what to do with his life, Fred Behrens considered his options carefully. The Air Force flew the sexiest aircraft, the jets that screamed across the sky at supersonic speeds. But the Air Force required a college degree to become a pilot, and Fred Behrens didn't have the time or the money for 4 years of university. The Navy had carrier aviation, which was certainly exciting, but again there were educational requirements and a long training pipeline. The Army, on the other hand, offered something different. The Army needed helicopter pilots badly in the late 1960s because the Vietnam War was chewing through aviators at an alarming rate. The helicopter was the defining weapon system of Vietnam, the machine that made air-mobile warfare possible, and the Army simply could not train pilots fast enough to replace the ones being killed and wounded in combat. The Army would take young men who had never touched a flight control, put them through an accelerated training program, and turn them into combat pilots faster than any other branch of the military. Fred Behrens signed up for exactly that reason. He wanted to fly, and the Army was willing to teach him. The fact that the training would put him in the cockpit of a helicopter flying combat missions in Vietnam didn't particularly concern him. Fred Behrens still had a romantic and heroic notion of what war was like, and he got those notions from Hollywood. The movies of the 1950s and early 1960s showed war as something noble, something where the good guys were easy to identify and the bad guys fell down dramatically when they got shot. John Wayne charged up hills and liberated grateful villagers. The heroes always survived, or if they died, it was a glorious sacrifice that meant something. Nobody in the movies talked about the smell of burning fuel and burning flesh. Nobody showed what a landing zone looked like when the enemy had already zeroed in their mortars. Nobody explained what it felt like to see a helicopter ahead of you in the formation suddenly explode into a fireball and know that the crew you had breakfast with that morning was now dead. Fred Behrens would learn all of these things, but he didn't know them yet. He just knew he wanted to fly. Army Flight School began at Fort Walters in Texas for primary helicopter training and continued at Fort Rucker in Alabama for advanced training. The program was designed to turn civilians into military pilots in approximately 9 months, which was an incredibly compressed timeline by any standard. Fred Behrens learned the fundamentals of rotary wing flight, which was completely different from fixed-wing aviation. Helicopters didn't fly so much as they beat the air into submission, their rotors creating a disk of lift that had to be constantly managed and adjusted. The controls were demanding in ways that airplane pilots found counterintuitive. You flew a helicopter with both hands and both feet, coordinating cyclic, collective, and pedals in a continuous dance that became instinctive only after hundreds of hours of practice. The statistics for helicopter pilots in Vietnam were grim, and anyone paying attention to the news knew it. The average life expectancy for a helicopter pilot in combat was measured in weeks, not months, and the casualty rates were shocking by any standard. Over the course of the war, more than 5,000 American helicopter crew members would be killed and thousands more would be wounded. The Army was losing pilots and aircraft at rates that would have been inconceivable in any previous conflict. Some estimates suggested that a helicopter pilot's chances of being killed, wounded, or shot down during a standard one-year tour approached 1 in 3. Those odds were worse than almost any other military occupational specialty, including the infantry grunt who humped through the jungle with 60 pounds of gear on his back. The helicopter crews faced a unique combination of dangers: anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, weather, terrain, and the constant exposure to combat that came from flying multiple missions every day. But Fred Behrens was young and believed in his own invincibility the way all young men believe in their invincibility. He figured the statistics applied to other people, not to him. That's how it works when you're 19 or 20 years old and invincible by definition. You know intellectually that people die in combat, but you can't really imagine that you will be one of them. The belief in personal immortality is what allows young men to volunteer for dangerous duty, to climb into aircraft that they know might not come back, to face enemy fire with something resembling courage. Fred Behrens had that belief, and it served him well in training. Whether it would serve him in combat remained to be seen. The Army trained Fred Behrens on the UH-1 Huey, which was the workhorse helicopter of the Vietnam War. The Huey was a Bell helicopter design that had evolved through multiple variants since its introduction in the late 1950s. By the time Fred Behrens was learning to fly, the UH-1H model was the standard configuration for most Army aviation units in Vietnam. The Huey could carry troops into combat, evacuate wounded soldiers, resupply remote fire bases, and provide gunship support depending on how it was configured. Pilots who flew Hueys in Vietnam had to be ready for anything, and the training reflected that reality. Fred Behrens learned to fly in all kinds of conditions, learned to land in tight spaces, learned to hover steady enough for troops to jump out or wounded soldiers to be loaded in. He learned the emergency procedures that might save his life if the engine quit or the tail rotor got shot off. He learned about autorotation, the technique that allowed a helicopter to land safely even with a dead engine by using the main rotor as a windmill to slow the descent. He learned about retreating blade stall and settling with power, and all the other aerodynamic phenomena that could kill a pilot who didn't respect the physics of rotary wing flight. The instructors at Fort Rucker included many pilots who had already completed tours in Vietnam and knew exactly what the students were heading into. These instructors pushed hard, washing out candidates who couldn't meet the standards, because they knew that a marginally qualified pilot would be dead within weeks of arriving in country. Fred Behrens made it through the program, earned his wings and his warrant officer bars, and received his orders for Vietnam. The flight to Vietnam took Fred Behrens from the familiar world of American military bases across the Pacific to an alien landscape that nothing could have prepared him for. The plane approached Tan Son Nhut Airport outside Saigon, and the passengers could see the sprawl of the city below them and the patchwork of rice paddies stretching to the horizon. And then the pilot came on the intercom and told everyone to stay calm. The plane had to circle the field because there was incoming rocket fire. That's how Fred Behrens was welcomed to Vietnam. He sat in his seat and listened to the muffled crumps of explosions below while the aircraft circled and waited for the attack to subside. The other passengers, a mix of soldiers and support personnel heading to their assignments, looked at each other with expressions that ranged from fear to resignation. The veterans who were returning for second or third tours just stared out the windows with blank faces, remembering what awaited them on the ground. Fred Behrens realized in that moment that Hollywood had not prepared him for any of this. The war wasn't waiting for him to get settled in. The war was already happening, and it didn't care that he had just arrived. Fred Behrens was processed through the replacement system, assigned to his unit, and transported north to join the 101st Airborne Division in 1st Corps, the northernmost military region of South Vietnam. Fred Behrens was assigned to the Kingsman, which was an assault helicopter company with the 101st Aviation Battalion. The Kingsmen had earned their nickname from the playing card insignia they wore, a spade that symbolized their role as the ace up the division's sleeve. They had a legendary reputation among the helicopter crews in Vietnam, built through years of flying the most dangerous missions in the country. The history of the Kingsmen traced back to the buildup of American forces in Vietnam during the mid-1960s. Originally designated as the 17th Assault Helicopter Company, they had been absorbed into the 101st Aviation Battalion when the Screaming Eagles deployed to Vietnam. The Kingsmen flew Hueys into some of the hottest landing zones in the country, supporting operations from the demilitarized zone in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south, wherever the 101st Airborne needed them. They did it day after day without complaint, maintaining a tempo of operations that would have been impossible without the dedication of their maintenance crews and the courage of their aviators. The Kingsmen flew Hueys into some of the hottest landing zones in the country, and they did it day after day without complaint. They supported the infantry units of the 101st Airborne Division, the famous Screaming Eagles, who traced their lineage back to the D-Day landings at Normandy. Where the Screaming Eagles went, the Kingsmen followed, and the Screaming Eagles were always in the thick of the fighting. The 101st operated in the mountainous jungle terrain of I Corps, conducting operations against North Vietnamese Army units that infiltrated across the demilitarized zone and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos. Fred Behrens was a replacement pilot, fresh from the States, and the veterans looked at him the way veterans always look at new guys. They called the new arrivals FNGs, which stood for something that wasn't polite but accurately captured the disdain that experienced pilots felt for untested replacements. It wasn't personal. The veterans had simply seen too many new guys come and go. Some of them went home after their tours completed. Others went home in body bags. Some went home in pieces, missing arms or legs or faces. The veterans didn't get too attached to the new pilots until they proved they could handle the work, because getting attached to someone who might be dead tomorrow was more pain than anyone could bear repeatedly. The new pilots rode in the right seat, while experienced aircraft commanders occupied the left seat and handled the critical phases of flight. Fred Behrens watched and learned as his aircraft commander demonstrated how things actually worked in Vietnam, as opposed to how they were supposed to work according to the training manuals. He learned the little tricks that kept pilots alive, the ways to approach a landing zone that minimized exposure to enemy fire, the techniques for spotting ambushes before walking into them, the radio calls that meant, "Get out immediately," versus the calls that meant, "Proceed with caution." Fred Behrens absorbed everything because he understood that his life depended on learning fast. Fred Behrens received his baptism of fire at a place called Firebase Ripcord. The Battle of Firebase Ripcord was one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire Vietnam War for the 101st Airborne Division, and most Americans have never heard of it. The Nixon administration was committed to the policy of Vietnamization, withdrawing American troops while turning the war over to the South Vietnamese. And the last thing they wanted was another controversial battle making headlines. The media was discouraged from covering ripcord, and the battle faded into obscurity even as it was being fought. Firebase Ripcord sat on a hilltop in the mountains northwest of Hue, approximately 20 miles from the ancient city and overlooking the A Sha Valley. The A Sha Valley was one of the most dangerous places in all of Vietnam, a major infiltration route for North Vietnamese troops and supplies coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. American forces had fought bitter battles in the A Sha throughout the war, including the notorious Hamburger Hill engagement in May 1969, where the 101st Airborne had taken horrific casualties assaulting a fortified North Vietnamese position, only to abandon the hill days later. The political fallout from Hamburger Hill had been intense, and military commanders were under pressure to avoid anything similar. Firebase Ripcord was supposed to support an offensive called Operation Texas Star, which aimed to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines and destroy enemy base camps in the A Sha Valley. The 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne began rebuilding the abandoned firebase in March 1970, under the command of Colonel Ben Harrison. The firebase consisted of several hilltops that had been cleared and fortified, with bunkers and fighting positions and artillery pits. But the terrain was so rugged that everything had to be brought in by helicopter. Firebase Ripcord depended entirely on helicopter resupply for food, water, ammunition, and reinforcements. There were no roads, no other way in or out except by air. The North Vietnamese Army watched the Americans rebuild Firebase Ripcord and made their own plans. The PAVN 324B Division, which had encountered the 101st Airborne multiple times before and knew exactly what to expect from American firepower, surrounded the firebase with approximately 25,000 troops. They positioned anti-aircraft guns and heavy mortars on the surrounding ridgelines. They dug bunkers and prepared positions from which they could fire on helicopters approaching the firebase. And on July 1, 1970, they began their assault. The siege of Firebase Ripcord lasted 23 days, and every one of those days the helicopter crews of the 101st Airborne had to fly through enemy fire to keep the firebase alive. The North Vietnamese knew exactly when the helicopters would come and exactly what approach routes they would use. They had been watching for months, studying American patterns and procedures, and now they were ready to knock helicopters out of the sky. The approaches into Ripcord became gauntlets of green tracers and rocket-propelled grenades. Mortar rounds walked across the landing zone as helicopters tried to touch down. Anti-aircraft guns on the surrounding hills fired down into the firebase, creating crossfires that were almost impossible to avoid. Fred Behrens flew into Firebase Ripcord during the siege, bringing supplies and evacuating wounded. The experience was unlike anything his training had prepared him for. The mountains seemed to close in as the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, and the crack of small arms fire mixed with the heavier thump of machine guns created a symphony of violence. Tracers arced past the aircraft, some close enough that Fred Behrens could see the individual rounds tumbling. The helicopter shook as rounds punched through the aluminum skin, and Fred Behrens learned to ignore the damage and focus on flying. Fred Behrens took a piece of shrapnel during one of those missions into Firebase Ripcord. He doesn't talk much about the specific circumstances, just that he was hit, and that he ignored the wound and kept flying. That's what the pilots did in those circumstances. If you could still fly, you kept flying, because there were men on the ground who needed resupply and wounded soldiers who needed evacuation. Nobody wanted to hear about a little piece of metal in your arm or your leg when there were helicopters getting shot down and infantry companies getting overrun. The ground troops were fighting for their lives, and the helicopter crews were their only lifeline. The casualties at Firebase Ripcord mounted daily. On July 22nd, the North Vietnamese launched a major assault on Alpha Company's position, and 14 Americans were killed, with another 56 wounded in a single engagement. Lieutenant Colonel Andre Lucas, the commander of the 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, was killed during the evacuation of the firebase on July 23rd, along with his operations officer. First Lieutenant Bob Kalsu, who had been an offensive lineman for the Buffalo Bills and was the only active professional athlete killed in Vietnam, died at Ripcord on July 21st. Chuck Norris's brother Wyland Norris was also killed during the battle. By the end of the siege, 75 American soldiers had died at Firebase Ripcord, and many more had been wounded. The helicopters suffered almost as badly as the infantry. Chinook cargo helicopters had been shot down on the firebase itself, their wreckage adding to the chaos. One Chinook was hit directly above the ammunition dump and crashed into the stored explosives, detonating in a fireball that stripped supplies and sanity from the defenders. Hueys had been damaged and destroyed in numbers that staggered even veteran pilots. The 101st Aviation Battalion counted its losses and found them unprecedented. If the Nixon administration had not suppressed media coverage of Ripcord, the helicopter casualty figures alone would have made national news. Firebase Ripcord was evacuated on July 23, 1970. The American command realized that the position was not defensible, that they were losing too many men and too many helicopters trying to hold a hilltop that had no strategic value worth the cost. The evacuation itself was a harrowing operation, with the last defenders loading onto helicopters under mortar fire while B-52 bombers waited to carpet bomb the abandoned firebase. The airstrikes that followed were intended to destroy anything useful left behind and to punish the North Vietnamese forces that had humiliated an American division. After the intense and costly battle at Firebase Ripcord, Fred Behrens started thinking he might not survive his tour. That thought changes a pilot. Some men become more cautious, more careful about the risks they take, calculating every approach and departure for maximum survivability. Others become fatalistic, figuring that if their number is up, then their number is up, and there's nothing they can do about it anyway. Fred Behrens kept flying, but he carried the knowledge of Ripcord with him for the rest of his tour. He had seen what the enemy could do to helicopters. He had watched fellow pilots get shot out of the sky. He understood now that Hollywood was wrong about everything, that war was not noble or heroic, but merely brutal, and that survival was mostly a matter of luck combined with skill. Fred Behrens was transferred to a different unit, where he flew a smaller helicopter called the Loach. The official designation was OH-6 Cayuse, named after a Native American tribe, as was common practice for Army helicopters of that era. But everyone in Vietnam called it the Loach because of the light observation helicopter program that spawned it. The name came from pronouncing the LOH acronym, and it stuck because pilots like having unique names for their aircraft. The Loach was a tiny helicopter compared to the Huey. It was designed by Hughes Aircraft and powered by a single Allison turboshaft engine that produced about 285 horsepower. The entire helicopter weighed less than a Volkswagen Beetle when empty, which gave it an extraordinary power-to-weight ratio. The Loach was fast and nimble, capable of aerobatic maneuvers that larger helicopters couldn't attempt. It had a distinctive egg-shaped fuselage with a bubble canopy that provided exceptional visibility in all directions. Pilots who flew Loaches either loved them or hated them, but nobody disputed that they were fun to fly. What made the Loach controversial was the mission it was designed to perform. Scout pilots flew low and slow over the jungle canopy, looking for enemy positions and troop movements. They flew at treetop height, sometimes lower, peering into the vegetation for signs of bunkers, trails, fighting positions, or any other indicators of enemy activity. When they found something suspicious, they would mark it with smoke grenades or call in artillery strikes or guide ground troops to the location. But finding the enemy often meant getting shot at first. The standard tactical formation for scout operations was called a hunter-killer team, pairing a Loach with an AH-1 Cobra gunship. The Loach would fly low and draw enemy fire, essentially using itself as bait, while the Cobra circled higher and waited to pounce. When the enemy opened up on the Loach, the Cobra would dive in with rockets and miniguns and destroy whatever had revealed itself. The system worked, in the sense that it located and eliminated enemy positions, but it worked at a terrible cost to the Loach crews. Scout pilots had the highest casualty rate of any helicopter assignment in Vietnam. A scout pilot's expected survival time was measured in months, not years. Fred Behrens liked flying the Loach, despite the danger. The helicopter was responsive and maneuverable in ways that the bigger Huey could never match. Fred Behrens could put a Loach into places that seemed impossible, could hover between trees and slip through gaps in the canopy, could turn on a dime and accelerate away when things got too hot. The intimacy of the small cockpit, with just the pilot and a gunner who sat in the rear compartment, created a different kind of flying than the crew coordination required in a Huey. Fred Behrens enjoyed that aspect of the assignment. The problem wasn't the helicopter. The problem was the unit. Fred Behrens found himself in a dysfunctional outfit where the leadership was poor and the morale was worse. The details of that dysfunction aren't recorded in his story, but anyone who served in Vietnam knows that some units simply didn't work well. Perhaps the commanding officer was incompetent or absent. Perhaps the maintenance crews couldn't keep the helicopters flyable. Perhaps there were personality conflicts or disciplinary problems, or just an accumulation of bad luck that had broken the unit's spirit. Whatever the specifics, Fred Behrens knew he didn't want to stay there. Fred Behrens managed to arrange another transfer, this time to a medical evacuation unit called Eagle Dustoff. The Dustoff call sign was synonymous with medevac operations throughout Vietnam, originating with the 57th Medical Detachment back in 1963. Major Lloyd Spencer had chosen the name because helicopter pickups in the dry countryside kicked up so much dust, and the call sign stuck. Eagle Dustoff was the medevac platoon of the 326th Medical Battalion, which was part of the 101st Airborne Division. Unlike some medevac units that operated independently, Eagle Dustoff was integrated into the division's structure and flew specifically in support of the Screaming Eagles. The Dustoff crews flew UH-1 Hueys, configured as air ambulances, with litter racks and medical equipment and the distinctive Red Cross markings that were supposed to protect them under the Geneva Conventions. The supposed protection was largely theoretical. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong shot at medevac helicopters just as readily as they shot at gunships, and the Dustoff crews knew it. The Red Cross on the nose made the helicopter more visible, not more protected. But the Dustoff crews flew anyway because their mission was to save lives, and saving lives meant flying into places where lives were being lost. The Dustoff mission was different from assault helicopter operations in ways that Fred Behrens found appealing. Flying assault missions with the Kingsmen had meant delivering troops into combat, watching young men jump off the skids and disappear into the jungle where some of them would die. That felt like delivering men to their deaths, even though Fred Behrens understood intellectually that those troops would have walked into the same combat if helicopters hadn't existed. The emotional reality was that Fred Behrens dropped them off and flew away, and some of them never came back. Flying medevac missions meant bringing the wounded out, which felt like saving lives rather than ending them. Fred Behrens could see the men he evacuated loaded onto litters, could watch the medics working on them during the flight back to the hospital, could see them unloaded at the medical facility with at least a chance of survival. The wounded men often grabbed his hand or his arm as he helped load them, looking into his eyes with gratitude that was almost unbearable to witness. Fred Behrens was giving them something precious, the possibility of seeing their families again, and that made the risks worth taking. That made the fear manageable. Dust-off crews developed a reputation throughout Vietnam as the pilots who would fly anywhere and do anything to recover wounded soldiers. The standard response to a medevac request was immediate launch, regardless of conditions. If troops were taking casualties, dust-off would come. If the landing zone was hot, dust-off would find a way. If the weather was terrible and visibility was marginal and every regulation said you shouldn't be flying, dust-off would give it a try, because there were wounded men who would die without evacuation. This culture of going in no matter what produced extraordinary heroism and extraordinary casualties in roughly equal measure. The crews became closer than family. A dust-off helicopter typically carried a crew of 4, 2 pilots in the cockpit, a crew chief who maintained the helicopter and operated the door guns, and a medic who provided medical care to the wounded during the flight to the hospital. These 4 men flew together day after day, shared meals and sleeping quarters, developed the kind of bond that comes from trusting each other with your life repeatedly. The pilot depended on the co-pilot to monitor the instruments and provide backup control. Both pilots depended on the crew chief to keep the helicopter flyable and to call out threats during approach and departure. Everyone depended on the medic to care for the wounded once they were aboard. The crew operated as a single organism, each member knowing his role instinctively after hundreds of shared missions. Fred Behrens flew routine medevac missions throughout his time with Eagle Dust-Off, developing the skills and instincts that separated experienced dust-off pilots from new arrivals. He learned to read landing zones as he approached, spotting the subtle signs that indicated enemy presence versus the chaos of friendly troops under fire. He learned the approach angles that minimized exposure to likely enemy positions. He learned to coordinate with the crew chief and medic who handled the wounded in the cargo compartment, communicating through headsets and hand signals to ensure efficient loading, even when bullets were flying. Fred Behrens had developed a routine that involved regular flights to a hospital ship offshore. The Navy maintained hospital ships in the waters off Vietnam, the USS Sanctuary and USS Repose being the primary vessels, to provide medical care for wounded soldiers and sailors that exceeded what land-based facilities could offer. These hospital ships had surgical suites and intensive care units and specialized equipment that could save lives which would otherwise be lost. When medevac helicopters had patients who needed more than what the division clearing station could provide, they flew the critical cases out to the hospital ships. Fred Behrens made these runs often enough that the crew and the deck teams knew each other by sight. The hospital ship landing procedures were different from land-based operations, with the helicopter settling onto a moving deck and being secured by sailors who risked injury from the rotor wash. On one of these flights, something peculiar happened that Fred Behrens has never forgotten. His crew chief mentioned that there was a major sitting in the back of the helicopter, just sitting there without saying anything. Fred Behrens hadn't been told he was transporting any passengers besides the wounded, and he wondered who this mystery officer was and why he was hitching a ride on a medevac bird. The major never explained himself, never identified his unit or his purpose, just rode along and disappeared when they landed. Fred Behrens never found out what that was about, whether the officer was some intelligence type running a secret operation or a staff officer cadging a ride to the ship, or something else entirely. Vietnam was full of small mysteries like that, unexplained things that happened and were never resolved. The chaos of the war meant that strange occurrences were simply accepted and filed away, because there was no time to investigate every anomaly. Operation Lam Son 719 was the worst period of the Vietnam War for American helicopter crews, and Fred Behrens flew through all of it. The operation began in early February 1971 and continued until late March, and it would prove to be a decisive test of the Nixon administration's Vietnamization policy. The objective was to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and disrupt North Vietnamese logistics for the upcoming dry season. If successful, the operation would demonstrate that the South Vietnamese Army could conduct major operations independently, paving the way for continued American withdrawal. The operational concept was straightforward in theory. South Vietnamese ground forces would advance along Route 9, an old colonial road that ran from the coast into Laos, and seize the town of Chaponi, which served as a major logistics hub on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. American forces would provide support from within South Vietnam, but were prohibited from entering Laos by the Cooper Church Amendment, which Congress had passed to prevent the Vietnam War from expanding into neutral countries. This meant that American helicopters would fly South Vietnamese troops into Laos and support them with medevac, resupply, and fire support. But no American ground troops would participate in the operation itself. The North Vietnamese knew Lam Son 719 was coming. They had watched the American buildup at Khe Sanh, the old Marine combat base near the Laotian border, and correctly surmised that something major was planned. They responded by massing forces in the operational area and establishing the most formidable air defense network that American helicopter crews had ever faced. The ridge lines along Route 9 and the approaches to Chapone were studded with anti-aircraft guns. Heavy machine guns in the 12.7mm class, capable of penetrating helicopter armor at ranges over a mile. 23mm automatic cannons that could shred a Huey with a single burst. 37mm anti-aircraft guns with the range and hitting power of Second World War weapons. The North Vietnamese had learned from years of American air operations how to concentrate firepower against helicopters, and they applied that knowledge ruthlessly. Fred Behrens flew dust-off missions into Laos as part of Lam Son 719, evacuating wounded South Vietnamese soldiers from landing zones that were under constant attack. The helicopter losses began immediately and accelerated as the operation continued. In the first days of the operation, helicopters seemed to fall from the sky continuously. The landing zones that intelligence had assessed as safe turned out to be carefully prepared killing grounds, where anti-aircraft guns waited in concealed positions. Helicopters that successfully landed to discharge troops were hit while sitting on the ground. Helicopters that managed to take off were hit during their climb-out. Helicopters that made it back to Khe Sanh were often so badly damaged that they never flew again. The mechanics and maintenance crews at Khe Sanh worked around the clock, patching battle damage and returning helicopters to flyable condition. Some aircraft came back with so many holes that the crews wondered how they had stayed airborne. The crew chiefs reported finding bullets lodged in flight control cables, rounds that had punched through critical systems without severing them, damage that should have been fatal but somehow wasn't. The ground crews cannibalized wrecked helicopters for parts, swapping components as fast as they could install them, trying to keep enough aircraft flyable to support the operation. The human toll was equally devastating. Pilots and crew members who had survived dozens of missions found themselves shot down for the first time. Crews that had never lost a man suddenly lost everyone. The dust-off pilots flew mission after mission into the maelstrom, picking up wounded South Vietnamese soldiers whose own helicopters couldn't or wouldn't come for them. Fred Behrens saw things during Lam Son 719 that stayed with him forever. The burning wreckage of helicopters scattered across the landing zones, the bodies of American aviators who hadn't made it out, the desperate faces of wounded men reaching up toward the helicopters that might save them, or might be shot down trying. The operation officially lasted 45 days, from the initial crossing into Laos on February 8th to the final withdrawal on March 25th. The South Vietnamese Army reached Chepone, technically achieving the stated objective, but the victory was hollow. The ARVN forces suffered nearly 50% casualties before retreating back across the border in chaos. Some units disintegrated entirely. Television cameras captured South Vietnamese soldiers clinging to helicopter skids as the aircraft lifted off, so desperate to escape that they risked falling to their deaths rather than remain on the ground. The images became iconic symbols of the war's failure. The American helicopter losses during Lam Son 719 were staggering by any measure. Over 100 helicopters were destroyed completely, burned-out hulks scattered across the Laotian jungle, and the approaches to Khe Sanh. Another 600 helicopters were damaged, many so severely that they were not expected to fly again. The 101st Airborne Division alone lost 84 aircraft destroyed and over 400 damaged. More than 200 American aviators were killed, wounded, or missing as a result of Lam Son 719. It was the deadliest period of the entire Vietnam War for American helicopter crews. Fred Behrens brought his Huey and his crew through Lam Son 719 intact and uninjured, which was something close to a miracle given the circumstances. How he survived when so many others didn't is a question Fred Behrens can't fully answer. Partly it was skill developed through hundreds of hours of combat flying. Partly it was the quality of his crew, the coordination between pilot and co-pilot and crew chief and medic that made the difference between getting in and out versus getting trapped. Partly it was pure luck, the random chance that determined which helicopter got hit and which one didn't, which bullet found its mark and which one missed by inches. Fred Behrens later said they were a little loopy when they got back to their base after the operation ended, meaning they had that 1,000-yard stare that came from sustained exposure to combat. The crew had flown mission after mission into the worst anti-aircraft environment of the war, had watched other helicopters go down in flames around them, had listened to the radio calls of pilots who were hit and going in, and somehow they had survived when so many others had not. The psychological weight of that survival was heavy. The knowledge that luck, rather than merit, had kept them alive while better men had died. The mission that almost killed Fred Behrens started with him volunteering when he shouldn't have been flying at all. The Army had regulations governing crew rest, rules that limited how many hours pilots could fly in a given period to prevent fatigue from degrading performance. Fatigued pilots made mistakes, and mistakes in combat got people killed. Fred Behrens was already over his allotted hours, which meant the regulations said he should have been resting, sleeping, or at least staying on the ground while his body recovered from the accumulated stress of continuous operations. But when word came that a ground unit was under siege and all the other dust-off helicopters were already committed to the mission, Fred Behrens offered to get an additional ship in the air. He couldn't sit on the ground while infantry soldiers bled out waiting for evacuation. The dust-off ethos of never leaving wounded men behind was stronger than any regulation. Fred Behrens gathered his crew, ran through the pre-flight checklist, and lifted off to join the mission. The rules could wait. Fred Behrens flew out to the site of the battle and found something strange when he arrived. The other medevac helicopters were circling overhead. They weren't going in. The radio chatter indicated that the landing zone was extremely hot, that multiple approach attempts had been driven off by intense fire. Fred Behrens was puzzled by this because the whole point of dust-off was to go in regardless of the danger. That was the mission. That was why the wounded men and their units trusted the medevac crews. You didn't circle overhead while soldiers died on the ground below. Fred Behrens got on the radio and asked what was happening. Someone told him the landing zone was just too hot, that going in was suicide. Fred Behrens had been in hot landing zones before. He had flown into Firebase Ripcord during the siege. He had flown into Laos during Lam Son 719. A hot landing zone was just part of the job. Fred Behrens pushed the cyclic forward and put his Huey into a descent. He was going in. The approach was everything the other pilots had warned about. Tracers crisscrossed the air ahead of the helicopter, the distinctive green of North Vietnamese ammunition weaving patterns in the sky. Mortar rounds impacted around the landing zone, sending up fountains of dirt and debris. Fred Behrens could hear rounds striking the helicopter, the distinctive metallic punches that meant bullets were penetrating the airframe. He held his approach steady, flared at the last moment, and settled the Huey into the chaos. The ground troops loaded wounded soldiers onto the helicopter as fast as they could move. The crew chief and medic pulled the casualties aboard, while Fred Behrens held the aircraft in a hover, ready to climb out the instant the loading was complete. Bullets continued to snap past the cockpit, close enough that Fred Behrens could hear them over the rotor noise. The helicopter was taking hits throughout the airframe, but the controls still responded, and the engine was still running, and that was all that mattered. Fred Behrens pulled pitch and climbed out of the landing zone with his first load of wounded. He flew them back to the medical facility, dropped them off, and turned his helicopter around. There were more wounded men at that landing zone, and Fred Behrens intended to get them. On the second approach, or perhaps the third, Fred Behrens encountered a situation that required a different kind of extraction. Some wounded soldiers couldn't be reached by helicopter landing because the terrain or the vegetation made it impossible to put a Huey down. Dense jungle canopy, steep slopes, rocky outcroppings, all the features that made Vietnam's terrain so difficult for conventional operations also made helicopter landings impossible in many locations. In those cases, the medevac crews used a hoist. The hoist was a cable with a jungle penetrator or a litter attached, capable of being lowered through gaps in the canopy to reach wounded soldiers on the ground below. The helicopter would hover above the trees. The crew would lower the hoist through whatever opening they could find, the wounded soldier would be attached, and then the crew would winch him up through the gap. The process was painfully slow, often taking several minutes for each casualty, and during that entire time, the helicopter had to hover motionless at a fixed altitude. For anti-aircraft gunners and enemy soldiers with rifles, a hovering helicopter was the easiest possible target. Fred Behrens brought his Huey into a hover above the jungle and began extracting a wounded man with the hoist. The cable paid out through the trees while the crew chief operated the winch and the medic prepared to receive the casualty. It was getting dark, the tropical dusk falling rapidly, the way it does near the equator. Fred Behrens knew he would have to turn on his position lights so the other helicopter pilots in the area could see him and avoid a mid-air collision. But turning on the lights also meant the enemy could see him, pinpointing his position against the darkening sky. Fred Behrens made the call and switched on the lights because avoiding a collision was the immediate priority. The tracers came up almost immediately. The North Vietnamese gunners had been waiting for exactly this moment, when the American helicopter would be pinned in place with its lights blazing like a beacon. Fred Behrens watched the green tracers arcing up toward him and willed the hoist to move faster. The wounded man was coming up through the canopy, dangling on the cable, completely exposed, and moving so slowly it seemed like time had stopped. Fred Behrens held his hover steady, despite every instinct screaming at him to get out of there. He couldn't drop the wounded man. He couldn't cut the cable and leave him to die. All he could do was hold position and trust that the enemy gunners would miss, that the tracers would pass close but not close enough, that luck would hold for just a few more seconds. When the casualty finally cleared the trees and the crew pulled him aboard, Fred Behrens put the Huey into a dive and got out of the area as fast as the aircraft would move. Fred Behrens dropped off that wounded soldier and returned to the battle once more. By now he had lost track of how many missions he had flown that day, how many wounded soldiers he had evacuated. The fatigue that the crew rest rules were supposed to prevent was setting in, dulling his reactions and narrowing his focus to the immediate task. But Fred Behrens kept flying, because there were still wounded men who needed him. The dust-off mission didn't end until all the casualties were evacuated, or until the medevac helicopters themselves became casualties. On one of these approaches, something extraordinary happened. An enemy soldier fired a rocket-propelled grenade at Fred Behrens' helicopter. The RPG was a shaped charge weapon designed to penetrate armor, and a direct hit on a Huey would almost certainly destroy the aircraft and kill everyone aboard. Fred Behrens saw the flash of the launch and the smoke trail coming toward him, and then the grenade hit one of the skids and bounced off without exploding. Fred Behrens felt the impact through the airframe and watched the RPG tumbling away into the jungle below. The warhead had not detonated on contact, which was the only reason Fred Behrens was still alive. Why it didn't detonate is unknowable. Perhaps the warhead was defective. Perhaps the angle of impact prevented the fuse from functioning properly. Perhaps some random factor in the manufacturing process half a world away had created a dud that saved an American helicopter crew. Whatever the explanation, Fred Behrens filed it away as another one of those Vietnam miracles that couldn't be explained, completed his mission, and kept flying. The final mission came when Fred Behrens got a call that some Rangers were getting shot up at a bad landing zone. Army Rangers in Vietnam conducted long-range reconnaissance and direct action missions deep in enemy-controlled territory. They operated in small teams, typically 6 to 12 men, and when they made contact with the enemy, they were almost always outnumbered and outgunned. The Rangers depended absolutely on helicopter support for insertion, extraction, and fire support. When a Ranger team was in trouble, getting them out was the highest priority. 2 dust-off helicopters had already tried to reach the Rangers, and both had been shot down. The landing zone was so hot that nobody else wanted to attempt it. The Rangers were pinned down, with wounded men among them, and without evacuation, they would probably all be killed. The enemy had the position zeroed in, knew exactly where the helicopters had to land, and was waiting to destroy anything that came in. Fred Behrens decided he would try. He had already violated the crew rest regulations by flying at all. He had already made multiple approaches into hot landing zones. He had already taken fire and seen an RPG bounce off his skid. But the Rangers needed him, and Fred Behrens was not going to let them die without making every effort to save them. Fred Behrens flew his Huey to the coordinates and found exactly what he had been warned about. The landing zone was a nightmare, with enemy fire coming from multiple directions and the wreckage of the 2 downed helicopters visible on the ground. The Rangers were huddled in whatever cover they could find, returning fire against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere. Fred Behrens made his approach, descending into the storm of tracers and explosions, and sat his Huey down in the middle of the chaos. The Rangers loaded their injured squad leader onto the helicopter, moving with the disciplined speed that came from intensive training and desperate necessity. Fred Behrens held the aircraft steady while bullets cracked past, and the rotor wash kicked up debris that stung exposed skin. The moment the wounded man was aboard, Fred Behrens pulled pitch and climbed out of the landing zone under heavy fire. Fred Behrens got the squad leader to safety and turned his helicopter around for another run. There were more wounded Rangers back at that landing zone, and Fred Behrens wasn't going to leave them there to die. He had watched 2 other helicopters get shot down trying to make this same approach. He knew the enemy had the position zeroed in, knew they were waiting for him, knew that the odds of surviving another trip into that landing zone were slim. But the Rangers were counting on him, and Fred Behrens was going back. Fred Behrens made his second approach, bringing the Huey back down into the storm of tracers and explosions that had already claimed 2 other aircraft. The enemy fire intensified as the helicopter descended, as if every gun in the area had been waiting for this moment. And that's when Fred Behrens took a bullet through his ankle. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Fred Behrens felt his foot go numb and then start throbbing with an agony that made it hard to think. The bullet had shattered bone and torn through tissue, and the wound was bleeding badly. But the ankle wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that the helicopter was taking hits all over. Bullets were punching through the thin aluminum skin, smashing instruments, severing hydraulic lines, destroying systems throughout the aircraft. The Huey shuddered and began to yaw as Fred Behrens struggled to maintain control with one foot that wouldn't respond properly. The pedals controlled the tail rotor, which was essential for maintaining directional control. And Fred Behrens couldn't feel what his foot was doing. The collective was getting mushy as hydraulic pressure bled away. Warning lights were illuminating across the instrument panel, red and amber indicators showing system after system failing. The helicopter was dying around him. Fred Behrens knew the aircraft was going down. He had seconds to decide what to do, seconds to choose between trying to nurse the dying helicopter back to friendly lines or putting it down immediately before he lost all control. The decision was made for him when the helicopter stopped responding to his inputs. Fred Behrens fought the controls all the way to the ground, doing everything he could to keep the crash survivable, trying to flare at the last moment and reduce the impact speed. The Huey went in hard. Fred Behrens felt the impact slam through his body, felt the world tumble and spin as the helicopter came apart around him. The noise was indescribable, the shriek of tearing metal and the thunder of the rotors disintegrating. And then there were more bullets. The enemy knew exactly where Fred Behrens had crashed, and they weren't finished with him. They were firing into the wreckage, trying to ensure that no one survived. Fred Behrens took another bullet, and another, and another. By the time the shooting stopped, Fred Behrens had been hit 5 times. He was bleeding from multiple wounds, his flight suit soaked with blood, his body broken in ways he couldn't assess in the chaos of the moment. The helicopter was a crumpled wreck around him, and the enemy was closing in to finish the job. Fred Behrens managed to get out of the destroyed helicopter and into the jungle. How he did this with 5 bullet wounds is something that defies easy explanation. The human body is capable of extraordinary things when survival is at stake, and Fred Behrens was not ready to die. He crawled and dragged himself away from the wreckage into the dense vegetation that might offer concealment from the enemy soldiers he could hear searching for survivors. Night was falling, and Fred Behrens was alone. He had no radio to call for help, no weapon to defend himself except perhaps a pistol if he could reach it. No medical supplies beyond whatever basic first aid he could improvise. He found cover in the vegetation and waited, listening for the enemy soldiers who were hunting for him. Every sound in the jungle could have been his death approaching. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every call of a bird could have been the signal that the enemy had found him. Word got back to the Eagle Dust-Off base that Fred Behrens was dead. The other crews had seen his helicopter go down, had seen the enemy fire concentrated on the crash site. Nobody could have survived that, they thought. The helicopter had been shot to pieces in the air and then crashed into enemy-held territory, and the enemy was clearly determined to kill everyone aboard. Fred Behrens was written off as killed in action, another pilot lost in a war that had claimed so many. Fred Behrens' friends mourned him. His belongings were packed up to be sent home to his family. The paperwork began for notifying his next of kin, the terrible process that informed families that their loved one would not be coming home. The casualty reporting system moved with bureaucratic efficiency, updating records and generating notifications. Fred Behrens was officially dead. Fred Behrens spent 2 nights in the bush, hiding from the enemy and trying to survive his wounds. The jungle in Vietnam was not a forgiving place even for healthy men, and Fred Behrens was far from healthy. The tropical environment was hostile to human life in dozens of ways. The heat and humidity sapped strength even from those who were uninjured. The insects were relentless, mosquitoes carrying malaria and other diseases, ants that could strip a wounded man's flesh, leeches that attached to any exposed skin. The vegetation concealed snakes and scorpions, and 100 other hazards. And the enemy was everywhere, searching for downed air crews who represented both potential prisoners and confirmed kills to report to their commanders. Fred Behrens was bleeding from multiple bullet wounds. He was probably going into shock, his body struggling to cope with the massive trauma of being shot 5 times in rapid succession. Blood loss alone could kill him if he didn't find a way to slow the bleeding. Infection was already beginning in the wounds. The omnipresent bacteria of the jungle finding easy entry through torn flesh. Without antibiotics, without clean water, without any of the tools of modern medicine, infection could kill as surely as the bullets themselves. Fred Behrens had no food, no water, no medical supplies beyond whatever he could improvise with strips of clothing pressed against his wounds to slow the bleeding. All Fred Behrens had was his determination to live. He lay in his hiding place and listened to the jungle sounds around him, trying to distinguish between natural noises and the sounds of enemy movement. He drifted in and out of consciousness as his body fought to survive. He thought about home, about the people waiting for him, about all the things he still wanted to do with his life, and he refused to die. The Rangers found Fred Behrens 2 days after the crash. These were the same Rangers he had been trying to rescue, the men who had watched his helicopter get shot down coming in to save their wounded. They had survived their own ordeal, fighting their way out of the trap that had claimed 2 helicopters and threatened to kill them all. And then they had gone back, searching the jungle for any sign of the dust-off crew that had sacrificed themselves trying to help. When the Rangers found Fred Behrens still alive, they couldn't believe it. The man had been shot 5 times, crashed his helicopter and spent 2 nights in the bush surrounded by enemy soldiers who were actively hunting for survivors. By every reasonable expectation, Fred Behrens should have been dead. But Fred Behrens was still breathing, still conscious enough to recognize his rescuers, still hanging on to life with the same stubbornness that had carried him through Ripcord and Lam Sun 719, and all the other impossible situations he had survived. Fred Behrens was airlifted out of the jungle and taken to a medical facility where the doctors went to work on his wounds. The bullets had done significant damage, shattering bones and tearing through muscle and tissue. Fred Behrens faced a long recovery with multiple surgeries to repair the destruction. He had lost a lot of blood, and his body was fighting off the infections that had started in his wounds. The prognosis was uncertain for a while as the medical staff worked to stabilize him and begin the healing process. Fred Behrens was stubborn in recovery as he had been stubborn in combat. He had survived the initial shooting, survived the crash, survived 2 nights in the jungle, and he wasn't about to die in a hospital bed. He endured the surgeries and the rehabilitation and the slow process of learning to use his body again. The wounds would leave scars that Fred Behrens carried for the rest of his life, permanent reminders of that final mission and the helicopter that had died around him. The recovery was long and difficult, and Fred Behrens was not always satisfied with the treatment he received from the Army. There was sometimes indifferent care, the kind of bureaucratic medicine that treated patients as numbers rather than individuals. Fred Behrens was a wounded combat veteran who had risked his life repeatedly for his country, who had flown into situations that other pilots avoided, who had earned every award and recognition that the military had given him. And he felt he deserved better than what he was getting from a medical system that seemed overwhelmed and impersonal. The Army hospitals in that era were dealing with a flood of casualties from the war, and individual attention was hard to come by. The staff were doing their best, but their best wasn't always good enough for the men who had sacrificed so much. Fred Behrens lay in his hospital bed and watched the system process wounded soldiers like products on an assembly line, efficient but mechanical, lacking the human connection that might have made the experience less painful. The worst part came at the end. The Army showed Fred Behrens the door while he was still in a wheelchair. The medical board determined that his wounds were severe enough to warrant a medical discharge, and the paperwork was processed with the same bureaucratic efficiency that governed everything else in the military. Fred Behrens had survived a crash and 5 bullet wounds, had given everything he had to the war effort, had flown missions that should have killed him, and now he was being told his services were no longer required. The medical discharge process was designed for efficiency, not for the emotional needs of wounded warriors. Fred Behrens filled out forms and signed documents and sat through evaluation boards that treated his service as a series of data points to be assessed and categorized. His wounds were measured and photographed and assigned disability ratings according to formulas that had no capacity to capture what he had actually experienced. The man who had flown into Firebase Ripcord during the siege, who had survived Lam Son 719, who had taken 5 bullets trying to save wounded Rangers, was reduced to a file folder full of medical records and administrative paperwork. The transition to civilian life was brutal for many Vietnam veterans, and Fred Behrens had it worse than most because he was transitioning in a wheelchair. The country had turned against the war by 1971, and the men who fought it were often treated as pariahs rather than heroes. There were no ticker tape parades for the Vietnam veterans, no grateful citizens thanking them for their service. Some veterans were spat upon. Others were called baby killers by protesters who had never been closer to combat than their television screens. The society that had sent Fred Behrens to war now seemed eager to forget that he existed. Fred Behrens left the Army bitter about the way he had been treated. He had loved being a pilot, had loved the flying and the mission and the camaraderie of the crews. He had volunteered for dangerous assignments because he believed in the dust-off mission, believed that saving wounded soldiers was worth any risk. And now he was being pushed out, unable to walk, unable to fly, unable to continue the career he had built. The helicopter pilot who had dreamed of flying since childhood, who had joined the army specifically because it offered the quickest route to the sky, was grounded forever. Fred Behrens has some definite opinions on what went wrong in Vietnam, and he doesn't mind sharing them with anyone who asks. Fred Behrens believes the war was poorly managed from the top down, with political considerations overriding military judgment at crucial moments. He saw the consequences of those decisions in the blood of the men he tried to evacuate, in the wreckage of the helicopters that littered the landing zones, in the body bags that went home to families who deserved better explanations than they got. Fred Behrens doesn't speak as a politician or a historian. Fred Behrens speaks as someone who was there, who flew the missions, who took the bullets. He watched Firebase Ripcord get pounded into rubble because the command structure couldn't decide whether to reinforce or evacuate. He flew through Lam Son 719 and watched the disastrous results of an operation that was designed more for political impact than military success. He saw the Vietnamization policy fail in real time as South Vietnamese units collapsed under pressure that American units could have handled. The perspective of a combat veteran is different from the perspective of a general or a policymaker. Fred Behrens didn't worry about political implications or strategic considerations. Fred Behrens worried about getting wounded men out of landing zones and keeping his crew alive for one more mission. The disconnect between what the war looked like from the cockpit of a Huey and what it looked like from the Pentagon or the White House was enormous, and Fred Behrens believes that disconnect contributed to the ultimate failure of the American effort in Vietnam. The story of Fred Behrens is the story of thousands of helicopter pilots who served in Vietnam. Young men who flew into danger day after day because the ground troops depended on them. The Vietnam War was fought by helicopters in ways that no previous war had been, and the pilots and crews who flew those helicopters paid a terrible price. Of the roughly 12,000 helicopters that served in Vietnam, almost half were destroyed by enemy action, mechanical failure, or accident. Of the pilots and crew members who flew those helicopters, a disproportionate number were killed or wounded compared to other combat arms. The dust-off crews had it particularly bad. Flying unarmed helicopters into hot landing zones to evacuate wounded soldiers was inherently dangerous, and the dust-off loss rates reflected that danger. Approximately one-third of all dust-off crew members who served in Vietnam became casualties themselves, killed or wounded while trying to save others. 3 dust-off pilots earned the Medal of Honor for their actions, and countless others earned lesser decorations that nonetheless represented extraordinary courage under fire. The dust-off crews flew more than 900,000 missions over the course of the war, evacuating wounded soldiers at a rate that saved thousands of lives. The survival rate for wounded soldiers who were evacuated by helicopter was over 97%, a remarkable achievement that testified to the bravery of the crews and the effectiveness of the system they had built. Some of those pilots came home whole, carrying memories but no visible scars. Some came home wounded, like Fred Behrens, learning to live with limitations imposed by enemy fire. Some never came home at all, their names etched into the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. Fred Behrens came home in a wheelchair, discharged from the army he loved, carrying 5 bullet scars and a lifetime of memories from a war that most Americans would prefer to forget. Fred Behrens doesn't forget. Fred Behrens remembers the crews who flew with him, the soldiers he evacuated, the missions that went wrong, and the miracles that shouldn't have happened. Fred Behrens remembers Ripcord and Lam Son 719, and that final mission where everything came apart. He remembers the sound of bullets punching through aluminum, the feel of the helicopter dying around him, the terror of those 2 nights in the jungle, waiting to be rescued or killed. Fred Behrens remembers all of it, and he tells his story so that others will remember too. The Vietnam War ended more than half a century ago, and most Americans alive today were either not born or too young to remember it. The helicopter pilots who flew through the anti-aircraft fire and the tracers are aging now, their numbers diminishing each year as time claims what enemy fire could not. Their stories are disappearing with them, the memories of Ripcord and Lamb's Son 719 and countless other battles fading into history. That's why the stories matter, why they need to be told and retold and preserved for generations who will never know what those young men experienced. When you hear Fred Behrens tell his story, you understand something about the Vietnam War that the history books often miss. The war wasn't fought by generals and politicians, although they made the decisions that determined where and how the fighting would occur. The war was fought by young men like Fred Behrens, aviation nuts who joined the army to fly helicopters and found themselves in situations that no Hollywood movie could have prepared them for. They flew because flying was what they were trained to do. They flew into fire because there were wounded men who needed them. They flew until they couldn't fly anymore, and even then some of them kept trying. The helicopter was the defining technology of the Vietnam War, the machine that made American military operations possible in a country without roads, without railroads, without any of the infrastructure that conventional armies depended upon. The helicopter brought troops into combat and took the wounded out. The helicopter resupplied remote fire bases and evacuated positions that had become untenable. The helicopter was everywhere, its distinctive rotor sound the background music of the war. And the men who flew those helicopters paid a price that the country they served has never fully acknowledged. Fred Behrens took 5 bullets during a medevac mission in Vietnam and survived 2 nights alone in the jungle, while everyone who knew him thought he was dead. Fred Behrens came home in a wheelchair and was shown the door by an army that had used him up and no longer needed him. Fred Behrens is still here, still telling his story, still making sure that people understand what the helicopter pilots of Vietnam actually went through. That's the story of Fred Behrens, dust-off pilot, shot down and left for dead, survivor.